Most people who study the Book of Genesis and the ancient texts surrounding it come to the same conclusion about the women involved in the days of the Watchers. They were victims, innocent women, deceived by beings far more powerful than themselves. Women who had no idea what they were getting into. And for a long time, that felt like the right conclusion. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. That conclusion is not the full story. In fact, the deeper you go into Scripture and the ancient writings that surround it, the more you realize that the picture is far more complicated and far more sobering than most teachers are willing to admit. Because heaven did not respond to those women the way you respond to victims. Heaven responded the way you respond to participants. And the one sent to deal with them was not a counselor. He was not a messenger of comfort. He was the Archangel Michael, commander of the armies of God, the enforcer of divine order. And what Michael did to the wives of the fallen angels is one of the most rarely discussed judgments in all of ancient Scripture. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what happened, why it happened, and why the lesson buried in this story may be more relevant to the world we are living in right now than most people would like to believe. Let us get into it.
To understand the judgment, you have to understand the crime. And to understand the crime, we have to go back to the beginning of what many scholars call one of the darkest chapters in human history. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a description that has puzzled readers for centuries. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from all they chose. Now, the Hebrew phrase used here, Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, is the same phrase used in the book of Job to describe divine beings, heavenly beings, beings that existed before the creation of humanity. The ancient Jewish interpreters, the early church fathers, and the writers of texts like the Book of Enoch all understood this to be referring to a group of angelic beings who made a deliberate, willful decision to abandon their assigned place in the heavens and come down to the earth. These are the beings the Book of Enoch calls the Watchers. According to 1 Enoch, 200 of them descended on Mount Hermon, and they did something that was forbidden. They took human women as wives, they had children with them, and through those unions they introduced things into the human world that were never supposed to be here. The children born from those unions were the Nephilim, giants, beings of extraordinary size and appetite, who began to consume everything around them. And the Watchers themselves began teaching their wives, and through their wives, the rest of humanity, things that were supposed to remain locked away: forbidden knowledge, forbidden arts, the secrets of sorcery, of enchantments, of how to manipulate the spiritual world for personal power. That is the foundation of everything that follows. But here is the part of the story that most teachers skip over. The story does not just ask what the Watchers did, it asks what the women did with what they were given. When we hear this story, our natural instinct is to focus on the Watchers. They were the divine beings. They were the ones who broke rank. They were the ones who came down when they were supposed to stay up. And so the women, in our minds, become background characters, passive, caught up in something that was not their fault. But the text does not treat them that way, and neither does the judgment that follows. Here is what 1 Enoch actually describes. The women were taught, specifically, intentionally, and thoroughly taught. They were given knowledge of enchantments and root cuttings. They were taught sorcery. They were taught how to work with forces that were spiritual and dark and powerful. And the text does not describe them sitting in horror at what they were learning. It describes the spread of these practices, It describes how this forbidden knowledge moved outward from these women and corrupted the people around them. Now I want you to think about that very carefully. There is a principle that runs through all of Scripture, from the very beginning to the very end, and it is this: knowledge creates responsibility. When you know something, when you have been taught something, when you have been given access to something, you become accountable for what you do with it. These women were not stumbling through the dark. They were being educated by beings who had existed since before the creation of the earth. They were receiving instruction that was ancient, powerful, and deeply forbidden. And the record of what happened next makes it very clear that they did not refuse it. They did not push back. They did not call out to God for deliverance from what was being put in their hands. They practiced it. And through their practice, the corruption that the Watchers had introduced began to flow like poison into the veins of human civilization itself. By the time heaven turns its full attention to the earth in the days before the flood, what it sees is almost beyond description. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and the women they had taken, had grown into beings of enormous violence. First Enoch describes them consuming everything around them. First the animals, then the crops, and when there was nothing left, they turned on the people. The earth was drowning in bloodshed. But it was not just physical violence. The spiritual contamination was spreading just as rapidly. The forbidden knowledge that had been handed to the wives of the Watchers had filtered out into the broader population. Sorcery was no longer isolated. Enchantments were being practiced openly. People were using forbidden arts to manipulate one another, to seek power, to connect with spiritual forces that were not from God. Genesis 6 says it plainly: "The earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked at the earth, and saw that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." All flesh. Not just the Watchers, not just the Nephilim. All flesh. The whole of human civilization had been compromised. The whole of what God had created had been bent away from its purpose. And this happened not only because divine beings broke rank. It happened because the knowledge they brought with them found willing hands here on the earth to spread it further. Heaven was watching all of this, and heaven was not going to stay silent. The response from God was swift and total. The archangels were given assignments. Raphael was dispatched to bind Azazel, one of the leading Watchers, hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness. Gabriel was sent against the Nephilim to stir them against one another so that their own violence would consume them. Uriel was sent to warn Noah. Each assignment was specific. Each one was surgical. God was not burning everything down carelessly. He was dealing with each part of the corruption with precision. But the archangels had another assignment that First Enoch records with chilling clarity. After dealing with the Watchers themselves and the Nephilim they had created, the question remained: what about the women? What about the wives who had received the forbidden knowledge, who had spread it, who had been so deeply woven into the corruption of that age? They could not simply be ignored. Their role in what had happened was not passive, it was not accidental, and the judgment of heaven was not going to treat them as if it was. There is a moment in the text where you can almost feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. The Watchers have been bound, the Nephilim are destroying one another, the flood is coming to cleanse the earth, and then the attention turns to the women. Of all the archangels, Michael is unique in one very specific way. He is not described in Scripture as a teacher. He is not described primarily as a healer or a messenger. He is described as a warrior,
a commander, the one who stands on the side of God's people in times of warfare, and the one who enforces the judgments that God decrees. The Book of Daniel calls him the great prince who stands guard over God's people. The Book of Revelation shows him leading the armies of heaven. The letter of Jude shows him in direct confrontation with the devil himself. Michael does not negotiate. Michael does not hesitate. When God issues a decree, Michael executes it. And so when Michael moves toward the wives of the fallen angels, there is no confusion about what this means. This is not a visit of mercy. This is not a second chance being extended. This is the judgment of heaven being carried out by the one assigned to carry it out. The atmosphere shifts when Michael arrives in the story. Everything that had been in motion, the chaos of the Nephilim, the spreading corruption, the noise and darkness of that age, all of it seems to go quiet before the one who comes in the authority of God. Michael does not come in rage. He does not come with emotion. He comes with purpose. He comes with the weight of heaven behind every step. And he comes to do something that the ancient text records as one of the most severe spiritual judgments ever handed down to human beings who had crossed into forbidden territory.
1 Enoch chapter 19 describes the outcome in terms that are difficult to fully grasp at first reading. The wives of the watchers became sirens. Now, in the ancient world, a siren was not just a mythological creature from Greek legend. The concept pointed to something specific. Spirits that wander. Spirits that are bound to desolate places. Spirits associated with the dangerous edges of the world, the deep wires, the wilderness, the places that exist outside the order and safety of human society. The women who had been at the center of human life, who had been wives and mothers and members of communities, were severed from all of that. Their connection to humanity was broken. Their place in the ordered world was removed. They were bound, not to a prison underground the way the Watchers were bound, but to a different kind of exile, a wandering without rest, an existence in the borderlands between the world of the living and the spiritual realm, attached to neither, welcomed by neither. And here is the theological weight of that judgment that I need you to sit with for a moment. They had crossed boundaries. That was the heart of their sin. They had participated in the crossing of lines that God had drawn to protect the order of creation. The Watchers had come down from where they belonged, and the women had reached up toward what was forbidden to them. Together, they had broken the walls that God had put in place. And so the judgment that Michael carried out had a terrible symmetry to it. They had refused to stay within their boundaries. So heaven removed their boundaries altogether. And what is left when you remove all of your God-given boundaries is not freedom. It is wandering without end, without home, without rest. That was the fate of the wives of the fallen angels.
Now, I know that some of you watching this are asking the question that you should be asking. Were they not deceived? Were they not taken by beings more powerful than themselves? Does heaven really hold them responsible for what happened? And that is a fair and honest question. Let us deal with it directly. Scripture, from beginning to end, establishes one consistent principle about knowledge and accountability. When Eve was deceived in the Garden of Eden, the deception did not erase the consequence. God still addressed what had happened. The actions still carried weight. Being deceived does not automatically remove responsibility, especially when the deception is followed by ongoing participation. And that is the key word here, ongoing. The women in the days of the Watchers were not simply tricked once and then immediately repented. The text describes a sustained practice of the forbidden things they had been taught. Sorcery was not a one-time event. Enchantments were not practiced once in a moment of weakness and then abandoned. These things spread, they took root, they multiplied. And all of that points to a level of willing participation that goes beyond simple deception. The early Jewish interpreters of these texts understood this. The writers of the Talmudic period understood this. The ancient rabbis who wrestled with the Book of Enoch and its relationship to Genesis understood that the judgment handed down was not arbitrary cruelty. It was the precise and just response of a God who takes the corruption of his creation seriously. Michael did not act out of anger. He acted out of authority. And the judgment he carried out was the judgment of a God who does not ignore what has been broken. Now here is why this story is not just ancient history. Here is why this matters right now. Jesus himself, in the book of Matthew, pointed to the days of Noah as a picture of the last days. He said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." People were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the day Noah entered the ark, and they had no idea what was coming until the flood arrived and swept them all away. The days of Noah were not just days of violence. They were days when boundaries were being crossed on a massive scale. Boundaries between the divine and the human. Boundaries between the physical and the spiritual. Boundaries between what God had designed and what rebellious beings were introducing as a counterfeit. We live in a world right now where boundaries are being challenged at every level. The line between human and something else is being blurred in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. The spiritual world is being accessed and explored by people who have no framework of protection or accountability. Ancient practices that belong in the category of forbidden knowledge are being repackaged as wellness, as empowerment, as progress. And the lesson of the wives of the fallen angels is not a lesson of condemnation, it is a lesson of warning. Participating in what is forbidden does not protect you from the consequences of what is forbidden. The women thought they were gaining something. They thought the knowledge they were receiving was power. But what they were actually doing was weaving themselves into a judgment that would remove them from everything they had. Heaven is still the same. God is still the same. The principles that governed that age govern this one, and Michael is still the same.
So let me leave you with a question that I want you to think about long after this video ends. If heaven looked at those women and saw not victims, but participants, what is heaven seeing when it looks at us? What are we accepting that we should be refusing? What knowledge are we receiving that we should be pushing back? What boundaries are we walking across because the world around us says it is fine, it is normal, it is just the way things are now? The wives of the fallen angels did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy the world. They made choices, one at a time, until the choices had made them into something they were never supposed to be. Do not let that be your story. If this video made you think, if it opened up questions you had never considered before, drop them in the comments below. I want to hear what you are wrestling with. And if you want to go deeper into the world of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the ancient mysteries of Genesis 6, make sure you are subscribed because we are just getting started. This is a story that does not end with the flood, and the next chapter is one you do not want to miss.